Animals move across the planet in patterns so consistent that, for centuries, migration was treated as a natural rhythm rather than a scientific problem. Every year, billions of organisms travel across continents, oceans, and hemispheres. Birds leave breeding grounds and later return, often to the same regions. Marine species travel thousands of kilometers through environments that offer few fixed visual landmarks. Insects, despite having relatively simple nervous systems, also complete long-distance migrations, sometimes across multiple generations. At first glance, migration appears structured and reliable. However, the central scientific question is not that animals move, but how they integrate multiple environmental cues to maintain direction and timing during movement. Many migratory species show strong site fidelity, meaning they return to the same breeding or feeding areas across seasons. This occurs despite changes in weather, resource availability, and landscape conditions. Researchers have identified several navigational cues that contribute to this ability, including the position of the sun, patterns of polarized light, celestial cues such as stars, olfactory information, and sensitivity to Earth's magnetic field. These cues do not operate in isolation. Instead, they are thought to form part of an integrated navigation system that varies between species. While individual mechanisms are well documented, no single mechanism explains migration across all species or environments. The challenge in current research lies in understanding how these different signals are combined and weighted by the nervous system of the migrating animals. It is within this integration problem that the scientific mystery of migration continues to exist today. Animal migration includes some of the longest and most demanding movements in the natural world, spanning hemispheres and ocean basins. One of the best documented examples is the Arctic tern, a seabird that breeds in the Arctic and migrates to Antarctic waters before returning north. Tracking studies estimate that its annual round-trip migration can reach approximately 70,000 kilometers, making it the longest known migration in the animal kingdom. Another well-studied example is the bar-tailed godwit, a shorebird capable of non-stop transoceanic flights. Satellite tracking has recorded individuals flying from Alaska to New Zealand in a single journey exceeding 11,000 kilometers without stopping to feed or rest, sustained by large fat reserves accumulated before departure. In North America, monarch butterflies undertake long-distance seasonal migrations to overwintering sites in central Mexico. Unlike birds, no single monarch completes the full round trip. Instead, the migration is completed across multiple generations, with successive generations continuing the route. Marine mammals also undertake extensive seasonal movements. Humpback whales migrate between high-latitude feeding grounds and low-latitude breeding areas, often traveling several thousand kilometers annually. While the ecological purposes of these migrations are well understood, including access to food and reproduction, the navigational accuracy involved remains an active area of research. Scientists continue to investigate how multiple environmental cues are integrated to produce consistent, long-distance orientation across different species and habitats worldwide today. At first glance, long-distance migration raises a simple question: how do animals know where to go? The difficulty becomes clearer when considering the environments involved. Migratory species often travel across open oceans, deserts, or skies where stable visual landmarks are limited or absent, and where environmental conditions change continuously. Despite this, many animals still reach specific destinations with remarkable consistency across seasons and generations. Research indicates that migratory animals use multiple navigational cues rather than relying on one single system. These cues can include the position of the sun during the day, patterns of polarized light under certain atmospheric conditions, and the apparent movement of stars at night in species that migrate nocturnally. In some species, particularly salmon and certain marine organisms, chemical cues and water currents also play a role in orientation. Experimental evidence further supports magnetoreception in several groups, including birds, sea turtles, fish, and some insects, suggesting sensitivity to Earth's magnetic field may provide a directional reference during migration. However, the main scientific challenge is not identifying individual cues, but understanding how they are integrated within the nervous system. The reliability of these signals can vary with weather, geography, and time of day. As a result, animals must combine and weigh multiple sources of information dynamically. How this multi-cue integration produces reliable, long-distance navigation across different species and environments remains an active area of research in modern biology. One of the most widely studied components of animal navigation is sensitivity to Earth's magnetic fields. This field is generated by movement of molten iron in the Earth's outer core and extends outward into space, forming a geomagnetic field that varies in strength and direction across the planet. Although it is not directly perceptible to humans, there is strong experimental evidence that some migratory animals can use it as part of their navigation system. Magnetoreception has been supported by behavioral and experimental evidence in several groups, including birds, sea turtles, fish, and some insects. In controlled laboratory and field studies, these animals have shown orientation changes when exposed to altered magnetic fields, indicating that magnetic information can influence movement direction. However, the biological mechanisms underlying the sensitivity are not yet fully resolved. Leading hypotheses include presence of magnetite-based particles in certain tissues and light-dependent chemical processes involving proteins such as cryptochromes in the eyes of birds and other animals. Current evidence does not indicate that animals perceive magnetic fields as a visual image. Instead, magnetic information is thought to be processed as a sensory input that contributes to orientation decisions. How this information is combined with other cues, such as visual landmarks, polarized light, or celestial positioning, remains an active area of research. Unlike many environmental cues, the geomagnetic field is relatively stable at large scales, making it a useful global reference. However, how animals calibrate and adjust to regional variations in this field is still being investigated in modern biology today. Beyond Earth's magnetic field, many migratory species use celestial and atmospheric cues to maintain orientation during movement. One of the most well-documented mechanisms is solar navigation. In several bird and insect species, the position of the sun is used as a compass reference. Because the sun moves across the sky during the day, successful use of this cue depends on an internal timekeeping mechanism, often described as circadian clock, which allows animals to compensate for the sun's changing position. In some nocturnally migrating birds, experimental studies have shown that orientation can be influenced by star patterns under clear skies. Evidence from controlled laboratory conditions suggests that juveniles of certain species can learn to recognize stellar configurations during early development, which later support orientation during migration. However, this ability is not universal across all migratory species and is best documented in specific bird groups studied under experimental conditions. In addition to sunlight and starlight, polarized light patterns in the sky provide directional information in some species, particularly insects such as bees and ants, and in a limited number of bird species. These patterns arise from the scattering of sunlight in the atmosphere and can remain detectable even when the sun is not directly visible, such as during twilight. These cues are not used independently. Instead, available evidence indicates that migratory animals combine multiple environmental signals, adjusting reliance on each depending on conditions, such as cloud cover, habitat, and time of day. This multi-cue system supports navigation across changing environments during migration. Beneath the surface of the ocean, migration does not only occur across space, but also across depth. Each day, a massive movement of marine life takes place in what scientists call diel vertical migration. This process involves countless organisms moving upward towards shallower waters at night and descending back into deeper waters during the day. It is observed in a wide range of species, including zooplankton, small fish, and squid. This movement is primarily driven by predator avoidance and feeding behavior. Many smaller organisms rise toward the surface at night to feed on phytoplankton, which are more abundant in upper sunlit areas of the ocean. During daylight hours, they descend to deeper, darker waters, where they are less visible to predators. This daily cycle is repeated across vast areas of the world's oceans. Although the individual organisms involved are small, the combined scale of this movement is enormous. Diel-vertical migration is widely regarded as the largest daily migration of biomass on Earth. It involves the vertical transport of vast quantities of organic material and plays an important role in ocean food webs and carbon cycling. The movement is not perfectly uniform across all regions or species. Depth ranges, timing, and intensity can vary depending on environmental conditions, such as light levels, water temperature, and predation pressure. Despite these variations, the overall pattern is consistent enough to be observed globally through oceanographic studies and acoustic measurements. This hidden daily migration reveals that movement in nature is not always visible on the surface, yet can occur continuously on a planetary scale. Some of the most puzzling aspects of migration involve how animals reach destinations they have never previously visited. In many cases, migratory behavior is not taught by parents, and individuals complete journeys independently based on inherited biological programming and environmental cues. This raises important questions about the balance between genetic inheritance and learning and navigation. A well-studied example is the monarch butterfly in North America. Monarchs migrate seasonally between breeding grounds in the United States and Canada and overwintering sites in central Mexico. No single individual completes the full round trip. Instead, the migration is completed over multiple generations. Each generation follows the general migratory direction and timing, with navigation influenced by environmental cues, such as the position of the sun and an internal circadian clock. In birds, research shows variation between species in the extent to which migration routes are learned or inherited. Some species rely heavily on genetic programming for direction and timing, while others incorporate social learning from experienced individuals. Juvenile birds in some experimentally studied species are able to orient in migratory directions even without prior experience, indicating an innate component to navigation. However, innate does not mean independent of environment. Migratory orientation is typically shaped by a combination of genetic predisposition and real-time environmental feedback. Animals adjust their movement using available cues such as wind patterns, temperature changes, and food availability. Current scientific understanding supports the view that migration emerges from an interaction between inherited programs and environmental learning, rather than from a single fixed navigational blueprint. Migration is often described as one of nature's most reliable biological processes, but it is also highly sensitive to environmental change. In many species, successful migration depends on precise timing between internal biological rhythms and external seasonal conditions. When these conditions shift, migration patterns can become disrupted. One of the most well-documented drivers of disruption is climate change. Changes in temperature and seasonal cycles can alter the availability of food resources along migratory routes. In some bird species, this has led to mismatches between arrival times and peak food abundance at breeding sites. Similarly, shifts in ocean temperatures can affect plankton distribution, which influences the feeding grounds of fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. Artificial light at night is another factor affecting migration, particularly in birds and insects that use celestial cues for orientation. Urban lighting can disorient nocturnally migrating birds, increasing collision risk with buildings and altering flight paths. Habitat loss also plays a significant role, as the removal or fragmentation of stopover sites reduces the availability of resting and feeding locations required during long journeys. In marine environments, changes in currents and temperature can influence the distribution of migratory species such as tuna, sharks, and whales. These shifts may lead to changes in migration routes or timing, although many species show some capacity for adaptation over time. Overall, research shows that migration is not fixed but responsive to environmental conditions, making it vulnerable to rapid ecological change. When scientists study migration across species, a recurring question emerges. how do relatively small nervous systems generate such consistent long-distance navigation? This is not a claim that migratory animals possess human-like intelligence, but rather an observation that complex behavior can arise from biological systems with very different levels of neural complexity. Many migratory species have comparatively small brains or distributed nervous systems when measured against mammals such as primates. However, brain size alone is not a reliable indicator of navigational ability. What matters is how neural circuits are organized and how effectively they process environmental information relevant to survival and reproduction. In migratory species, these circuits are often specialized for integrating sensory cues, such as light, magnetic fields, chemical signals, and learned spatial information. Experimental studies in birds, insects, and fish show that navigation can be supported by relatively simple rule-based systems combined with sensory feedback. For example, orientation responses can be triggered by environmental conditions that are stable across generations, allowing effective migration without requiring complex cognitive representation of the entire route. At the same time, there is variation across species in the degree of flexibility involved. Some migratory animals show strong innate orientation patterns, while others adjust routes based on experience and environmental change. This suggests that migration exists on a spectrum between fixed genetic programming and adaptive learning. The central scientific challenge is therefore not to equate migration with human-style reasoning, but to understand how different biological systems solve similar navigational problems using different neural architectures. When scientists study migration across different species, one of the clearest conclusions is that it is not a single phenomenon with a single explanation. Instead, migration is a collection of evolved strategies that solve the problem of moving between locations where resources, breeding conditions, or survival chances change over time. These strategies have arisen independently in many evolutionary lineages, including birds, mammals, fish, insects, and even some invertebrates. What makes migration scientifically important is not that it is mysterious in a supernatural sense, but that it demonstrates how biological systems can produce highly reliable, large-scale behavior using different mechanisms. In some species, migration is strongly genetically encoded, with individuals showing directional tendencies even without prior experience. In others, learning and environmental feedback play a larger role in shaping routes and timing. Most cases likely involve a combination of both inherited tendencies and experience-based adjustment. Migration also highlights the importance of environmental structure in shaping behavior. Seasonal changes in temperature, daylight duration, food availability, and breeding opportunities create predictable cycles that many species have evolved to follow. Over long evolutionary timescales, natural selection favors individuals that can anticipate and respond to these changes effectively. Despite extensive research, scientists continue to refine their understanding of how multiple sensory systems and environmental cues are integrated to produce consistent navigation. The remaining questions are not about whether migration works, but about the detailed mechanisms that allow it to work so reliably across a wide range of species and environments. Across every ecosystem on Earth, migration reveals a consistent pattern. Living organisms respond to predictable environmental cycles by moving between regions that best support survival and reproduction. This includes seasonal changes in temperature, food availability, daylight duration, and breeding conditions. Over evolutionary time, natural selection has favored species capable of tracking and responding to these changes with increasing efficiency. What makes migration particularly significant is the diversity of biological mechanisms involved. Some species rely heavily on inherited behavioral programs that guide direction and timing. Others incorporate learning from experience, environmental feedback, or social interaction. In most cases, migration appears to result from a combination of genetic predisposition and real-time sensory input rather than a single controlling system. Research across disciplines such as ecology, neurobiology, and animal behavior has shown that migratory navigation can involve multiple sensory channels. These include visual landmarks, solar positioning, polarized light patterns, olfactory cues in aquatic environments, and sensitivity to Earth's magnetic field in some species. However, the degree to which each cue is used varies widely between taxa and environments. Despite significant advances in tracking technology and experimental research, scientists are still working to fully understand how these systems are integrated at the neural level. The remaining challenge is not describing migration as a phenomenon, but explaining in detail how different species combine available information to produce reliable long-distance movement across generations. Migration therefore represents not a single mystery, but a collection of biological solutions shaped by evolution to solve recurring environmental problems across the planet.